really what we're going to talk is a great extension of what Lior just referred to in the kind of SaaS sprawl and a lot of different best of breed SaaS applications that we're seeing popping up across the enterprise, and especially the requirement that is growing to integrate and connect these different SaaS applications to each other in order to create what we call internally the SaaS mesh or the business application mesh, but in fact it's creating the new modern network of an enterprise in the cloud. For example, for us as a startup, as a newborn company, which is cloud native or SaaS native, we don't have a network on-prem. We don't have a lot of infrastructure and connectivity on-prem. All our kind of connectivity and connections are occurring in the cloud between SaaS applications and between different applications that we don't own their infrastructure. And really what we're seeing over the past few years is really the adoption of best of breed SaaS applications. And maybe kind of unlike what Lior referred to, which is the problem of the long tail and the hundreds or thousands of SaaS applications that organizations are kind of purchasing and using today, which is a huge problem space of its own. We're referring to the core SaaS applications that organizations are adopting and kind of trusting with a lot of their core activities and business operations. And in order to fully deploy and enjoy these SaaS applications, we're starting to see SaaS-to-SaaS third-party integrations, whether if it's natively with third-party apps and with marketplace extensions, where we're all seeing these pop-ups that just ask for your consent and you can easily onboard and connect a new third-party vendor and provided access to your business applications or to your core SaaS applications. Or if it's through API tokens and integrations that are enabled usually with administrators and the kind of decentralized owners that have the privilege and the ability to connect new platforms to each other, or simply through no-code, low-code platforms like Workato, Zapier, Microsoft Power Platform, Integromat, and others that allow basically every user within the organization to become a citizen developer and to automate manual business workflows. And as such, we're starting to see this network of interconnectivity between the different SaaS applications. And now it's no longer how I protect only my Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, but what other vendors have access to these platforms and how do I control and govern this network of connectivity, which creates a lot of complexity. And today, what we'll kind of review is both macro trends that are leading to these new risks and threats. We'll walk through different attack examples and concrete example of attacks that they leverage this new SaaS mesh. And also we'll go into some examples of practical steps that you can take without any need of external tools or technology, and just by leveraging the administrative controls that they exist within core SaaS applications such as Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. So the first and maybe one of the most popular drives for this new SaaS mesh is OAuth third-party apps. So this is the kind of a quote from a recent study that shows that 97% of the Google Workspace users have authorized at least one third-party app. I think it's by Netscope. And we're all familiar with this consent screen, whether if it's in Zoom or Slack, Google Workspace, Microsoft 365, Salesforce, and basically every SaaS application that is going for a platform play and is trying to increase the usage, increase the adoption of their own platform by ensuring that for every new extension that you need, you can easily create it through your platform or through your connecting a new SaaS application to your core platform. So we're seeing a lot of these consent screen, a lot of these requests for new connections to OAuth applications. But the other side of that is that today end users have the ability to create endless number of connections to core applications, but it's very difficult to govern and manage these shadow OAuth connections. How well do you know if your users are, what are user granting? What have they authorized? What have they consented to? Did they understand what they were consenting to when they just clicked I agree or I authorize because they wanted to start using a new shiny tool? Is something that is becoming more and more difficult. And on the right is just an example from a communication with Box, requesting from an administrative standpoint to get visibility into all the connections that users are authorized to access the Box accounts, but without a proper solution, without a proper governance capability, because it's something that is happening more on the user level and not something that is easily centralized administrated and creates a lot of challenges from a security standpoint. On top of that, we're seeing API integrations. So we're seeing more and more independent and distributed IT business owners. So instead of the model that we were used to in the past, where we had central IT where everything had to go through it. And I think SaaS Pro is one example of that. But in addition, we're seeing the ability for a lot of people, let's say Salesforce administrator or Workday administrators or different administrators of core SaaS applications that no longer operate and work as part of the IT organization. And therefore, once IT is distributed and decentralized, we're starting to see also decentralized security risks because every business unit can now connect a new API integration, create a new connection based on using their administrative privileges and using their ability to generate a token, copy it, and paste it in a different platform. And as such, we're starting to see also overprivileged API integrations. As a vendor, a lot of vendors request highly privileged integrations and request a lot of capabilities that they can perform within the organization. And as administrators that don't have a lot of security awareness and don't come with an IT or security background, it's easier to provide higher privileges, but ensure the integration and the business function works instead of having to go through a rigorous process of a least privilege or zero trust, or ensuring that you give just enough privileges. And therefore, we're seeing more and more integrations that have way more privileges than what they actually need, therefore providing for third-party vendors and for supply chain access more capabilities and more permissions to perform actions within core applications, but not precisely something that is necessary from the business standpoint, and it's just a sitting duck from our perspective of a security concern. The last aspect is really related to no-code, low-code workflows. Today, we don't need to have developers only in the R&D department. We have citizen developers across the board in marketing, sales, IT, finance, HR departments, and they have intuitive, if this then that workflow automation platforms, which are great and very productive, like Workato and Zapier and Microsoft Power Platform and others, that allow them to build applications, ship logic, and create code or create applications without having to write code, without having to go through AppSec, DevSecOps, and any one of these procedures, and creating more and more exposure of sensitive data and of potential processes that are now exposed to external actors, even if it's not by design, it wasn't the purpose of that business unit, but they now have the power and the tools and the capabilities, leveraging very advanced technologies and automation and digital transformation to create a lot of business benefit, to create automated processes, but also to expose sensitive data and their core information and the core day-to-day activities. And these workflows and these no-code, low-code workflows are usually created in a very, the industry calls it citizen developers, but without a lot of governance from a security standpoint. And essentially this creates a exposure of from the kind of the weeds or kind of the end users that are now able to create more and more automation. And we're seeing different types of attacks that are focused on these integrations. So I listed here 3 examples of kind of the core categories of attacks that we're seeing. And there are a bunch of examples on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll go into specific examples over the next few slides. But I think the 3 main core attack vectors that we're seeing that are leveraging this SaaS mesh or this supply chain risk surface is the first of all, the supply chain API takeovers. So I think that today when security controls are getting more and more mature, attackers understand that they just need to find the weakest link and not precisely the most direct access to the data or the privileges that they're after. Therefore, they're targeting third-party vendors and trying to steal their tokens or stealing the privileges that were granted and trusted in the hands of these third-party vendors in order to gain access and unauthorized access to core data and to core privileges within organizations. So instead of seeing account takeovers and attacks that are focusing on how they can leverage credentials or leverage classic user accounts, they're focused on more of non-human SaaS-to-SaaS third-party integrations in order to gain access to their target and to their victim. On top of that, we're seeing malicious third-party apps. So again, going back to kind of the human versus the non-human element of SaaS applications, we're seeing with the high adoption of MFA, two-factor authentication, and great identity and access management controls that also Lior referred to in the previous presentation, we're starting to see more and more attackers that are resorting to consent phishing into malicious third-party apps instead of the classic phishing campaigns. So instead of requesting for a username and password or trying to phish for a username and password, the attackers are trying to get access to or to convince or trick end users to consent to malicious third-party apps that then provide them access, usually through OAuth, to core data and privileges within SaaS applications. Lastly, it's through hyperautomation exposure. So we talked about it a bit in the previous slide, but once these tokens can create or kind of be able to gain access to core applications, or once you grant access to core applications through these no-code, low-code hyperautomation platforms, you can now get more and more access by a kind of transitive access or indirect access once you breach or gain access to these platforms that have keys to the kingdom. And we've seen many different examples of attacks. If you look statistically over the past 2 years, the vast majority of attacks have been related to third-party access and to supply chain risks, or in general third-party vendors. Just this year, the OAuth breach, the GitHub breach, of course, and we've seen many examples of attacks, the MailChimp breach as well. And we're seeing more and more examples of these types of attacks that are focused on supply chain access. So going into specific examples, so I think the GitHub breach from a couple of weeks ago is a prime example of what happens when an organization could be breached, not through the attackers gaining direct access to their core SaaS applications, but just the attackers finding a trusted vendor, in this case, the Travis CI and Heroku, and through the access that they were granted, in this case, and through OAuth tokens, the attackers were able to gain access to core information and data, in this case, code, within GitHub, and steal that sensitive information and getting unauthorized access once they were able to impersonate or to leverage the grant and the trust that was granted to a specific third-party vendor. Now, the main first question that obviously comes to mind is, did any of our users grant this type of access, and whether or not this should be something that is affecting the organization specifically. But once you look at the number of core SaaS applications that you have today within the company, it's usually at least a dozen, if not a couple dozen of SaaS applications. It's important to be able to get visibility and controls at scale to all these different third-party vendors that are authorized by your users, in order to ensure that the investment in third-party risk management and vendor risk management procedures are effective, taking into consideration the crown jewels and the most business-critical SaaS applications. Another example was through the Solarwinds campaign. So I know the Solarwinds campaign was highly focused on what happened to Solarwinds as an organization, but overall, when you look at the different vectors or different techniques that the attackers used across the board within this process or within this attack campaign, we've seen multiple different examples of techniques that they use in order to leverage SaaS-to-SaaS third-party integrations. One of the examples is that they once they hacked into an Active Directory environment and they wanted to escalate their privileges or to have access to emails specifically, instead of gaining access to a human user that has access to that data, they added a token or certificate to an existing OAuth integration that already had the privileges that they wanted. And then they leveraged that access by using this certificate that they added in order to basically to impersonate an existing non-human identity or an existing integration in order to gain access to core data and to the emails of organizations. So leveraging this type of OAuth integration, which is usually less monitored, it's more difficult to profile and understand whether or not machine-to-machine or SaaS-to-SaaS type of activity is normal or abnormal. And being able to control this type of activities is more difficult for a lot of organizations. And therefore, the attackers knew that once they were able to kind of leverage that attack surface or that access surface to go under the radar, it's something that will allow them to easily gain access to sensitive data. Another technique that was, by the way, used through that campaign is breaching into legitimate companies like Mimecast, for example, stealing their certificates and being able to leverage that trust relationship between Mimecast as a well-known email security provider and their customers in order to leverage the access that was granted to Mimecast and to leverage that access in order to steal or to gain unauthorized access to Microsoft 365 tenants that trusted, again, third-party vendors with access to their core SaaS applications. Another example that we're seeing more and more now in the industry is the attacks that are leveraging no-code, low-code. So this is an example that was published by Microsoft a few years ago, where attackers leveraged Microsoft Flow specifically, which is their no-code, low-code, one of their no-code, low-code functionalities, in order to exfiltrate data and leverage the automation of stealing information from internal environments or from the core SaaS applications themselves or the core business applications within the organization out to their command and control servers. Now, these indirect data flows, which kind of remind things that we used to see through platforms like Bloodhound in the Active Directory world, maybe a couple of decades ago, or over the past 2 decades. And we're seeing that these indirect data flows and indirect connectivity that create a transitive communication line between core applications and other business applications allow the attackers to, again, go under the radar and leverage the machine-to-machine type of activities and integrations, and leverage the fact that today, when we're in a more and more automated world, and just thinking about it, over the past few months, we've increased significantly our go-to-market team, and we're just seeing the amount of automation that is going on between our marketing and sales tools, and how everything, one platform is recording the call, the others is storing the data, the third one is scheduling the calls, and a lot of information is flowing automatically between these different platforms. And attackers have recognized that this is a prime usage that can be used, a great usage for them is to use these platforms in order to essentially leak information or to perform actions that are less monitored and are not easily detected by existing approaches. The last example I want to go through is really focused on consent phishing, which I mentioned earlier, where essentially when you think about how consent phishing attacks operate, they focus on the fact that today, once our user has adopted multi-factor authentication for their Microsoft 365, if I just gain access to their username and password, it's not a very effective way for me to essentially perform account takeover attacks. And instead, what they're resorting to doing is to try to convince end users to consent and approve third-party apps that are within the kind of the ecosystem of the existing SaaS platform. And through these OAuth, rogue OAuth or malicious OAuth apps to gain access to the data and to the privileges, again, leveraging these non-human or machine-to-machine type of tokens and identities. And as such, it allows them to gain the authorization and gain the trusted access to these platforms without having to go through the existing authentication and identity and access management platforms. Because you can't put MFA on a machine, you can't put a managed device on a machine, and a lot of the existing security controls that we have in place are not really effective when it comes to securing these SaaS-to-SaaS interconnectivity. This exactly leads to kind of when we look and we try to analyze the existing approaches and what's missing in the industry, we realize that today we're heavily focused on that human to application layer. We have managed devices, endpoint security, identity providers, CASB, zero trust network access, all helping organizations secure that human to application layer, applying zero trust, being able to govern effectively how users are accessing their applications. But on the other side, we now have these apps and they're connecting to a bunch of different apps, a bunch of different third-party vendors, a lot of different solutions, and all these integrations and interconnectivity, non-human app-to-app or SaaS-to-SaaS or machine-to-machine type of interactions are ungoverned and don't have a lot of security controls and don't have a lot of best practices when it comes to the existing solutions that exist today in the market. And therefore, organizations need to be able or to look into how they get more and more visibility and control and governance over these sensitive third-party integrations and SaaS-to-SaaS interconnectivity. And to kind of finish a presentation, I wanted to start with showing a few examples of where you can start easily with your existing tools, your existing kind of admin interfaces with core SaaS applications. So first of all, why is it so complex to govern the SaaS mesh or this layer of interconnectivity? We have so many different ways to create integrations. Just looking at these few examples of core SaaS applications that exist across the board in a lot of organizations today, for each one of these integrations, you have, for each of these SaaS applications, there are so many different ways to create integrations. For example, in Microsoft 365, you can register an app, you can install an external enterprise application, you can use the Power Platforms that has Power Apps, Power Automate, Microsoft Flows. There are a lot of different ways to create these types of integrations. Same goes for Google Workspace, where you can use the marketplace, you can use app scripts, OAuth tokens, domain-wide delegations. There are a lot of ways to create these integrations. And it's important to make sure that you have proper coverage of all the methods, whether if it's through administrative grants or through end user grants that allow essentially to enable a third-party integration and an access from one platform to another, and to ensure that you're covering these different methods, because they can be easily leveraged in order for attackers to gain access and control these different SaaS applications. And more specifically, if you look at Microsoft 365, the easiest way to get started is going into enterprise applications. I added here also a link just as a reference, but you can go to the enterprise applications where you can slice and dice the different integrations. It's not always easy to completely understand and grasp the different complex permission models of these applications, especially Azure Active Directory is one of the more complex ones, but trying to understand and analyze how enterprise applications were granted access to your organization. So you can learn about delegated permissions and application permissions, and was it authorized by a user or an admin? Was it authorized and consented for the entire organization, or just for a specific context in a user? Does it have access to your SharePoint, to your OneDrive, to your Exchange, to your directory or Active Directory? And really understanding and analyzing the scope of access and the permissions that were granted to each one of these third-party vendors, and also more importantly, who's behind those integrations. Because in many cases, as an attacker, you would want to just present every integration with the most legitimate way or with the most legitimate name, but it's important to go through the metadata and the configuration of these integrations to make sure that you truly understand the vendor that is actually behind these platforms or behind these integrations. And on top of that, we have here also from Google Workspace. So Google Workspace has the review API controls under the security controls within the Google admin. It has more functionalities, of course, in the enterprise license compared to the regular license. Also, same goes for Microsoft 365. But essentially what you can do here is to be able to review both the controls and the configurations of who is allowed to configure what, and what are the restricted integrations, or what are the restricted scopes within your tenant, and to see usually the dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of third-party apps that have already access, that are usually through OAuth grants by end users. And more importantly, to review the domain-wide delegation, which are authorizations that were granted by administrators on behalf of the entire organization. And these integrations can impersonate every user within the organization. All they need is their email. And from there, they can do whatever they want on behalf of these users, assuming they were granted the proper scopes. So thank you very much. I hope this was helpful and kind of also productive to provide also effective tools to start looking at the SaaS mesh and being able to better understand this new threat landscape.